Leader, oppressor, interrupter, bystander, whistleblower, overseer. Many of us can find ourselves in any one of these positions, or we can find ourselves subject to them. But what wisdom does this story from the first book of the Bible have for us today? And let's just make sure that we're all on the same page. So again, we're at the end of Genesis, learning about Jacob, who was renamed Israel's family. So you may hear me use the names Jacob and Israel interchangeably. But Israel has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. But our characters don't really know that quite yet. And Jacob has a favorite son, Joseph. In this story, he's 17 years old. And that's 17 years of showing that favor, 17 years of his brothers building up resentment. Why? And I think this story explains just that. You heard the reading. His brothers hated him so much that they began to plot his murder. Obviously, they perceived Joseph to be an existential threat, enough to evince that kind of bloodlust. And the two parts of this story that explain that they believed he was an existential threat. None of this will make the right sense if you don't take into account a little bit more about Jacob's children, and I really want to break this down for you. Jacob's first wife, Leah, bore several sons. Reuben, who we heard about in this story, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar and Zebulun. She also bore Dinah, her sole daughter, who's mentioned in Genesis, though there may have been other girls. Leah also raised and claimed Jacob's sons from her handmaiden, Zilpah. Now, Jacob's second wife, Rachel, bore two sons, Joseph and Benjamin, and then she also raised and claimed her handmaiden, Bilhah's sons. But here's the thing. We need to be clear that in this story, the sons so-called mismanaging the flock were Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The children of the enslaved women, Zilpah and Bilhah, and we should say their names, Zilpah and Bilhah. And the handmaidens handed over to Jacob and his wives were given by Laban, Rachel and Leah's father, to birth children. These enslaved women were given to Jacob to birth children. And the story doesn't call out any of the other sons as mismanaging the flocks. But let me put it this another way. The boys, the sons of the handmaidens whose mamas were enslaved, very clearly were not bought into this enterprise. And Jacob didn't really like them so much, we hear. And remember, Joseph was the only son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, for quite some time. Benjamin wasn't born until much later, and he would always have been the favorite, above everybody else, above the sons of Leah, and also for sure above the sons of the enslaved women. And do you see where I'm going with this? Joseph may or may not have been any more virtuous or skilled at shepherding, but he certainly cared more about following daddy's rules than the others. And then he had this dream that we just heard about, right? Where all of them bowed down to them, which presumably they'd been having to do in one way or another and expected to do all of their lives. And turn with me for a moment back to his mama, Rachel. Now, Rachel was a brilliant shepherd, right? And as the story goes, actually, Jacob fell in love with her as he saw her tending her sheep so beautifully. And he fell in love with her for that reason. So Rachel was a savvy businesswoman. and she was skilled and she knew what she was doing. And presumably she would have imbued her firstborn son with that kind of information, with that wisdom. And she and Jacob, again, they did have another son, Benjamin, who's in the story but not explicitly discussed. And Benjamin grew up with an aged father and without the benefit of his mother because she died. And that might explain why the story doesn't indicate that he defended Joseph, his only full brother, in the conflict that was to come. Now, just in case you don't know where things are headed in the story next, the book of Exodus picks up this story. So Joseph, as he was sold into enslavement, was oppressed and rescued by his dreams, and a great leader in the land of Egypt, far from his homeland. And his brothers indeed would bow down to him again in the times to come. But as the biblical narrative opens the story, that's kind of a long ways away. Having established that, I want to go back to the three characters I want to highlight today: a leader, an interrupter, and a whistleblower. All iconic. And I want us to understand each one problematic. And let's start with the leader, Jacob, Israel. And we learn right away that Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, was working with his older brothers by another mother, and this tending the sheep. Remember that Jacob was a brilliant shepherd, and he was cunning, and that brought him great riches and great reward. But now in the story, Jacob's older, he's not really in a position to be able to tend to his flock, so he has his sons running the enterprise. And family business, especially at this scale, is tricky. Do you hear me? The leader can't be everywhere at once, so they have to figure out who they can entrust. And direct descendants have tended to be an obvious choice. But as Jacob would soon learn, some of his sons didn't hold the kind of loyalty that he expected. And Joseph reported on this on his brothers to his father. Here's where it really, really matters that we read the power dynamics at play, because Joseph has a lot to lose as the favored one. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, not so much. So maybe it is that Jacob was wise and saw his son had skill and sent him to give him innocent reports. But as we see very clearly, these reports had such consequences that his brothers wanted to kill him. So it's not as if it was just him telling on them saying, like, Dan hit me. No, this was something that actually had enough consequences that they wanted to kill him. And maybe Joseph was just offering the intelligence that Jacob required, or maybe he was acting as their overseer, cracking a whip on his older brothers, the sons of the enslaved who were born only for their potential labor. And in the traditional readings of this text, we are often led to have such sympathy for Joseph. We can't imagine why the brothers would want to do this to him, all of them. But then we start to realize that perhaps this wasn't so much a matter of bloodlust. It might have actually been more like a matter of survival. This was, in fact, an insurrection. The least favored ones were taking matters into their own hands in a way that actually wasn't going to work. It would not work. Why? Because, as it turns out, turning the master's tools against him is not a winning strategy. Bloodlust will never satisfy. But let's go back to Jacob, because history tells us that example after example of people, of leaders who have responsibilities for their flock, and many times they lose sight. And Jesus addressed this even. Jesus taught us that a good shepherd will leave the 99 to make sure that that one sheep isn't lost. And what this means then is that every person and every soul counts. And whether we're talking about 99 or 328.9 million people, if you are the leader appointed for the time, you protect every single one. Not just the ones who like you or make you feel good about yourself or bow down to you like sheaves in the field, and certainly not just your favorite son. In the metaphor of a shepherd to the sheep, the shepherd isn't looking to the sheep for validation. The shepherd is clear in her mission. She cares for the sheep. And Jacob failed as a patriarch because he failed to care for each one as his own. Rather than showing all of his children love and gathering them all in so that they didn't feel that they had to be at each other's throats to survive, he showered one with favor and immense privilege and riches like a technicolor dream coat, all while belittling the siblings. And Jacob fell for the caste system, the lies of the caste system, by oppressing most while showering the 1% with everything. And he paid quite the price for it. So what then are we to learn from Jacob and his family? I wish I had a definitive answer, but if I were to suggest something, it would be that we have to borrow from God and Jesus specifically. A leader cares for the flock, for everybody, for every soul. Favor that harms another is poisonous on every level. Jacob then was poisoned by his own lies, and so was Joseph. Because, as it turns out, oppressive behaviors and structures actually wind up harming the oppressed, for sure, disproportionately. But they harm the oppressors too, because they rely on the temporary gains of supremacy that is, quite frankly, unsustainable. Oppressors just never can receive the final word because there's just not enough of them to go around throughout history. So, in Jacob's story, who gets the final word? Now's about the time to bring God back into this, because you'll recall that Joseph had these dreams that held a prophecy of intelligence that none of them had the wisdom to interpret properly. See, when Joseph dreamt his dream and he envisioned the same old overseer dynamic, overseer to the enslaved, brother over brothers. He thought the point was that his brothers were supposed to bow down to him, when really I believe that this story is about something quite different, especially from a theological perspective. Joseph saw everyone bowing down to him, but really everyone would indeed need to bow down to God. The sheath at the center, the sun, the moon, and the stars that would bow down would not be bowing down to Joseph. They would be bowing down to the power of God that would save the people. The one they needed to bow down to was God. At so many points in the story, the people were in a point of peril, and Joseph was in a desert ditch with no water and brothers who wanted him dead. He was thrown into a ditch and sold into enslavement, and then held and imprisoned in a cell. And at every single turn, I want you to hear something. God intervened. Jacob was bereft of the son who he thought was dead, in whom he'd invested everything, while ignoring the rest of his progeny. And his family wound up being on the very brink of starvation over time. The flocks disappeared. They were in a famine, but then God intervened. Israel and his children, Egypt and hers, they all needed a miracle. And God granted it. Yes, Joseph wound up being a vehicle. He has a redemption story in this, but it's because God had granted the visions to make it happen. And this is my personal message to you today. Remember that God provided the visions, the prophecy. But then Joseph had to hold on to it, even if he misinterpreted it at first. He couldn't understand it when he was sitting high up on his horse, but humbled, aware of perspectives beyond his own, Joseph understood anew. And maybe you're in a ditch too. You may be in the ditch, parched as hell. And in the ditch, it very well could be that all you could hold on to is your dreams. How many children memorize Langston Hughes' dreams? I know I did. And if you did too, I invite you to say it with me. Hold fast to dreams, for when they die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow. And we need the reminder of poetry in times like this. Poets are dreamers, and we need the dreamers, and we need the gazers, and we need the science fiction writers, and even the prophets. So many learn this poem, but how many learn its cousin, also by Hughes, written in 1951? It's called Harlem. It's called Harlem, Montage of a Dream Deferred. And it reads, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe. It just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? So many of us dreaming, yearning, waiting for the day when leadership treats us each with the equality that we're meant to have and experience. Hughes was frustrated with this when he wrote about the dream deferred. Equality was a dream deferred for far too many, and it still is 70 years later. What I want to say is that it's dangerous when we don't dream, folks. It's very dangerous when we don't dream. It is equally dangerous for dreams to be deferred. And right now, dreams are exploding. And maybe that's not the worst thing. From my perspective, so long as God's behind your dream, God gives you a vision. But are you willing to receive it? God will keep the dreams alive. And with Joseph, God kept giving the dreams, renewing them, re-upping them into a way that the evolving Joseph could better comprehend. It's a redemption story for him too, you see. And that was God's work, was redeeming him, bringing him to an understanding of his dreams so that they didn't help him, they helped all the people. And taking the circumstances and giving what was necessary to feed the flock and protect them all. It was this perspective, not getting the people to bow down to him, but feeding them. That is what led to Joseph's liberation. Listen, we can't let our oppressors interrupt our dreams and visions. And oh, but they try. They will try. They'll tell you you're wrong. You're crazy. You've never had that dream in the first place. Oh, they will gaslight you and they will try to keep you up all night so that you can't even sleep long enough to have a dream. They will deport you. They will imprison you. And they will tell you what to do with your body. Maybe they'll even try to end your life and then blame you for it, even in your sleep. They will do everything they can to defer your dream and place an all-out assault on your ability to hope. But my job is to remind you that hope is a discipline and not a feeling. Hope is a muscle that we develop, and if we don't work at it, it will atrophy. And hear me loud and clear, God is putting a vision in front of you for your possibilities right now. Please hold fast. Hold fast to that vision. Hold fast to the dream. Be careful of who you share your dreams with. Keep your counsel, especially if you don't know how to interpret them just yet. Look what trouble that got Joseph in. Protect your flourishing. They may try to stick you in a ditch to dry up like a raisin in the sun. But God has other plans. Receive the vision and the words, and in the words that Jesus taught us to pray. May God's will be done. Amen.